Hi, my name is Nora. I'm 32, an elementary school teacher. All my life, I tried to please my mother, to earn her love. But no matter how hard I tried, nothing was ever enough. Then one night, she looked straight at me, eyes cold, voice sharp. "You were the biggest mistake of my life." The words cut deeper than anything she'd ever said before. But instead of breaking down, I did something unexpected. I smiled. And that smile changed everything. What happened next still echoes in both our lives. I grew up in a small Iowa town, quiet and neat. Our house was blue with white shutters, repainted every spring. From the outside, it looked perfect, like a family postcard. Inside, it was something else entirely. My mother, Amanda, had once been the town beauty queen. Miss Cedar Rapids, 1989. Blonde hair, flawless smile, glowing confidence. She dreamed of New York runways, flashing lights, magazine covers. Then she got pregnant with me at 22. My father left when I was 4, never coming back. After that, her eyes hardened, her voice colder, sharper than winter. She never said she loved me, not once, not ever. Instead, she reminded me what I had cost her. "I could have been somebody," she whispered to the mirror, tracing wrinkles at the corners of her perfect, bitter eyes. Those words carved into me deeper than any knife could. So I tried to fix it, to make her proud. Straight A's from the start. Perfect posture, perfect clothes, perfect room. I cleaned, I studied, I kept quiet, I obeyed. Hoping one day her smile would soften just for me. But it was never enough. She skimmed my report cards, saying, "This is expected, Nora." When I won the spelling bee in 5th grade, she only snapped that my outfit was wrong, my posture terrible. Every triumph turned into an insult. Every joy stolen instantly. The only warmth I knew came from Aunt Jasmine. She visited once in a while, whispering, "You're special. Don't forget." Those words were lifelines in a desert of silence. At 16, I sat alone with a cupcake I bought myself. One candle, one whispered song, one desperate birthday wish. She had left a note. Working late, leftovers in the fridge. Even my birthday was something she forgot. I closed my eyes that night and wished to be seen, to be remembered, to matter. But in that house, I was invisible. And the older I grew, the louder her silence became. Leaving for Northwestern was my first real breath of freedom. A dorm room barely big enough for 2 girls felt like luxury. No sharp eyes watching, no sighs reminding me I was unwanted. For the first time, the air didn't choke me. I studied hard, like always. But this time it was for me, not for her, not for approval that never came. My professors cared. My classmates noticed. Friends invited me in. I was building a life beyond her shadow. Still, the phone calls came. "Classes are fine. Yes, I'm eating. No, I don't need anything." The same script every week, spoken with a smile she couldn't see. Because if I told her the truth, she wouldn't care. Sophomore year, I volunteered at an after-school program in Chicago. 3rd graders, wide-eyed, desperate for attention, just like me once. Their laughter lit something in me. Teaching wasn't glamorous, but it felt like purpose. When I switched my major, her voice was icy. "Teachers are broke, Nora. You're too smart to waste it like that." But for once, I didn't bend. Not every decision was about money. Some were about meaning. That was when James appeared. Tall, curly hair, the kind of smile that softened storms. He listened. Not the fake kind, but really listened. When I confessed my truth, he said words I'll never forget. "You don't owe her for being born. That was her choice, not yours." Simple, steady, cutting through years of guilt like sunlight. For once, I believed it. For once, I believed in me. But bringing him home was a disaster. Amanda's eyes roamed him like he was hers to claim. Later, she sneered, "Hold on to this one. He's probably the best you'll get." Her voice dripped with poison, staining even love with bitterness. I cut the visit short, too embarrassed to explain. James reached across the car, squeezed my hand. "I get it now," he said quietly. And for the first time, someone truly did. Graduation came. She arrived late, left early, complaining about the heat. She missed my speech, ignored my professors, skipped my celebration. But in that moment, something shifted inside me. Her absence no longer dimmed the light I carried. I accepted a teaching job in Madison, Wisconsin. A tiny apartment, plants on the windowsill, shelves stacked with books. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. A life stitched together with dignity and peace. And yet, even miles away, her voice still echoed. On every phone call, in every decision. Like a ghost reminding me I would never be enough. But ghosts can be silenced, sometimes by truths you never meant to find. The call came one Tuesday night. Aunt Jasmine's voice was tight. "Nora, your mom collapsed at work. It might be her heart." I froze, red pen hovering over a spelling test. Complicated emotions slammed into me. Fear, guilt, resentment, duty. Is she going to be okay? They think so. She's asking for you. By dawn, I was in Cedar Rapids, my chest heavy. She looked smaller in that hospital bed. Fading blonde hair, skin pale, eyes sharp even when tired. "Nora," she rasped, "you didn't have to drive all this way." It was typical Amanda. No gratitude, no warmth. Just a reminder that even care was unwanted. Still, I stayed. Cooked her meals, drove her to checkups. 2 weeks passed on that old pull-out sofa in my childhood room. That's when I found the box. I was searching for sweaters in the attic, dust coating my hands. One cardboard box sat in the corner, labeled "Before." Inside, photos of her as a dancer, lithe, graceful, alive. Programs from performances, ribbons, an acceptance letter to a New York school, all dated just months before I was born. Beneath them, letters tied with ribbon. My father's handwriting, slanted, elegant, achingly familiar. At first, words of devotion. "You'll be the most beautiful mother." But later, venom. "You'll never let me forget what you gave up for this baby." But you forget I gave up things too. The difference is I don't blame our child. I sat frozen, letters trembling in my hands. Everything clicked. Her bitterness wasn't just about me. It was about what she lost, what she decided I had stolen. For the first time, I saw her as more than cruel. I saw the girl she had been. Brilliant, hopeful, crushed by choices. And still, instead of healing, she passed that crushing weight to me. When I came downstairs, she was at the kitchen table, scrolling her phone, sipping tea, eyes tired but sharp. I looked at her differently now, not as a mother I could fix, but as a woman too broken to love me. The tension between us built, every word another crack in the wall. She mocked my cooking, my clothes, my silence. And then, one night in the kitchen, it broke. I offered her pasta, simple, warm, enough for both of us. She sneered. "We've had pasta twice this week. Too much to ask for variety?" Something inside me snapped. "I've been here for 2 weeks, Mom. Cooking every meal, driving you, folding your laundry. I can't read your mind." Her eyes lit with fire. "Oh, so now you want gratitude for the bare minimum?" Her voice rose, venom spilling faster. "After all I've done, raising you alone, giving up everything." And then her final blow. Her voice low, steady, cruel. "You were the biggest mistake of my life." Silence. The words sliced me open. Confirmation of every childhood fear. For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. But then something shifted. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I smiled. Because hearing it out loud had set me free. She thought those words would break me. But they unlocked something else entirely. Her words still echoed. "You were the biggest mistake of my life." For years, I had dreaded hearing it spoken aloud. Now that I had, it no longer owned me. I set the knife down, turned off the stove. My voice was calm, but inside a storm raged. "You've told me my whole life what you gave up. New York, dancing, your dreams. But here's the truth. You chose, I didn't." Her eyes narrowed, but I pressed on. "I never asked to be born. I never asked you to give up your life. And I sure as hell don't deserve punishment for existing." For once, she didn't fire back right away. Her face flickered. Fear? Confusion? Something I had never seen before. I stepped closer, steady, unflinching. "I found the box in the attic, Mom. The letters. The acceptance letter. The photos. I know what you lost. I even understand it." My voice softened, but only for a breath. "But blaming me? That's cowardice." Her chair scraped against the floor as she stood. "You had no right to go through my things." I shook my head slowly. "Maybe not. But now I finally see the truth. You can't love me because you never forgave yourself." The words landed like stones, knocking the air from the room. "You hated yourself for what you lost. So you made me carry it for 32 years. But I'm done. Do you hear me? Done." Her lips trembled, a rare crack in her perfect facade. "You think you're blameless? You think I ruined everything?" "No," I said firmly. "I think you ruined yourself. And I refuse to be your scapegoat anymore." I grabbed my bag, my hands steady as steel. She reached for me, desperation leaking into her tone. "So that's it? You walk away? Just like him?" I froze at the doorway, turning back just once. "This isn't one fight, Mom. This is 3 decades of pain, sharpened into 6 words. You called me a mistake, but I've survived despite you. And now I'm taking back my life. Her face paled. For once, she had no script. No insult ready, no manipulation sharp enough to cut me down. The silence was deafening, but I felt lighter than ever. I walked out, past the walls that raised me, past the kitchen table where she broke me, past the door that had always felt like a prison. This time I didn't look back. Because she wasn't just losing an argument. She was losing control. And what came after would prove I was never her mistake. I was her reckoning. I drove straight to Aunt Jasmine's house, tears finally spilling. For 32 years I had held them back. Now they poured, cleansing, burning, freeing all at once. She didn't ask questions, just held me tight. Later, with tea in hand, she whispered, "Your mother called. I know what she said. She's wrong." That night I wrote a letter. Not for her, not really. But for me, for the girl who once lit candles alone. I filled pages with memories. The birthdays forgotten. The spelling bee dismissed. The graduation she spoiled. I paired them with victories she couldn't erase. My scholarship, my classroom, my chosen family of friends. And at the end, I wrote, "I was never your mistake. I was your chance. You just never took it." But I did. And I built a life without you. I left the letter on her kitchen table. A final gift. Or maybe a mirror. Then I walked away. Back to Madison. Back to my third graders. Back to the life I had stitched together with my own hands. Weeks passed. Then an email came. Just one line from Amanda. "I read your letter, and I haven't stopped crying." It wasn't an apology, not yet. But it was the first crack in her armor. A small, fragile space where healing might begin. Through therapy, I learned something vital. Her words said everything about her wounds, and nothing about my worth. Today, when I see children like Lily, too quick to call themselves stupid or not enough, I kneel beside them and say softly, "You're human. Mistakes don't define you. Love isn't earned. It's given." And in their eyes, I see myself. Not the mistake. Not the burden. The girl who survived. The woman who chose herself. So if you've ever been crushed by cruel words, if you've ever been told you weren't enough, remember this. Their wounds are not your identity. You are not a mistake. You are a miracle still standing. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family? Share your story in the comments. If this touched you, you're not alone. Hit subscribe for more stories like mine.
The vineyard shimmered in late afternoon light, rows of grapes stretching toward the horizon, the air thick with the scent of roses and polished wood. I smoothed the front of my dress, steadying my breath as I stepped into the registration line. Everyone around me buzzed with excitement, their voices rising like champagne bubbles. The woman at the table barely glanced at me before reaching into a cardboard box. She pulled out a small square of paper with a bent corner, printed in stark black letters. Limited guest. No gold edging, no ribbon, no elegant calligraphy. Just cheap laminate and a strip of tape, the kind used for factory tours. I stared at it for a moment, waiting for her to realize the mistake, but she only set it down on the table, already turning to the next guest. The woman behind me leaned forward, beaming as she received her gold-trimmed lanyard, her name written in sweeping script. She slipped it on like a jewel. I picked up the badge. Its edges curled slightly in the heat, for a heartbeat. I considered asking why. Then I felt a hand clap my shoulder, heavy and mocking. Cassian stood there, his suit a little too tight across the middle, his grin wide. "Guess they finally figured you out," he said, voice loud enough for the couple beside us to hear. They smirked, not at him, but at me. My cheeks burned. I wanted to answer, but no words came. Instead, I pinned the flimsy square to my dress, feeling its weight like a brand. As Cassian walked away, still chuckling, I forced myself forward into the hall where the music swelled, and the celebration waited without me. The music from the hall rose in bursts of laughter and clinking glasses as I stepped to the side, pressing my back against the wall. I touched the badge again, the paper softening beneath my fingers, and then my hand slid into my purse. My fingertips brushed the smooth envelope that had sat there for weeks, sealed and ready. Inside was the check $100,000. I had written it slowly, my pen digging into the paper as if each digit carried the weight of the hours behind it. Every overnight shift, every holiday I'd spent in the hospital instead of at home, Every postponed vacation and pair of worn-out shoes had led to this gift. It wasn't just money. It was years of my life, distilled into numbers on a page. When I first tucked it into the envelope, I imagined handing it to Isolde with pride, her eyes shining as she realized how much I had believed in her future. I thought it might be a bridge, a way back to the closeness we once had. But standing there now, the badge pressing into my skin like a scarlet letter, the envelope felt less like love and more like ransom. I closed my eyes and saw the nights I'd stumbled home after 18 hours on my feet, peeling off scrubs that smelled of antiseptic. I heard the echo of my own voice promising myself that the sacrifices would be worth it that one day. When my sister walked into her future, I'd be standing right beside her. But worth it to whom? To Isolde, who hadn't looked for me when I entered to Cassian, whose laughter still rang in my ears. The envelope grew heavier in my purse, as though it knew the answer. I pushed it deeper into the bag, clutching the strap tighter as I took a breath and stepped farther into the reception, determined to see where this night was truly headed. The sight of the envelope pressed me back into memory, pulling me to a morning that had split our lives in two. I was 19 when the phone call came, the one that told us our father's truck had been struck head-on by a driver who hadn't stopped drinking after last call. Overnight, the air in our small house thickened with silence, and suddenly everything was mine to hold. I remember standing in the kitchen, Isolde curled on a chair with her knees to her chest, Cassian pacing with fists clenched, demanding answers no one could give. I said I would take the night shifts at the diner until I found something steadier. I promised Isolde she wouldn't have to leave her school, that her world could stay intact, even if mine couldn't. It started small. I gave her my bedroom, telling her she needed space to study, while I folded out a cot in the corner of the living room when she wanted braces. I signed up for overtime at the hospital, shoes splitting at the seams as I pushed carts of supplies. Every holiday became just another shift to fill. By the time she was applying to college, I had built a second job into my weekends, enough to cover what scholarships didn't. Cassian never forgave me for stepping in as caretaker. He sneered at the extra hours I worked, called me a martyr whenever the bills were paid on time. You like being the hero. He'd spit, as if sacrifice were a crown I'd chosen instead of a weight I couldn't drop. But he never offered to carry it. I told myself it didn't matter. What mattered was that Isolde had everything she needed. I convinced myself my life could wait, that I'd pick it back up once hers was secure. Now, in the middle of a celebration where I barely belonged, I wondered if I had been building a foundation for her or digging a hollow underneath myself that I could never crawl out of. I first met Verity Aldwin months before the wedding, in a cafe that smelled faintly of citrus and linen. I had suggested the small diner near my apartment, a place where I knew the waitress by name and the coffee was always hot. Isolde insisted on something more fitting for the occasion. When I walked in, Verity was already seated, her posture elegant, her handbag perched on the chair beside her like a companion. She greeted me with a smile that didn't touch her eyes, the kind of smile that said she'd already measured me and found me wanting. After the waiter set down our drinks, she leaned in, her voice smooth as silk. It's remarkable, the way you've helped cover the deposit for the banquet hall. So generous, especially on a nurse's salary. The words were wrapped in sweetness, but the sting was sharp. I laughed softly, the practiced kind of laugh that smooths the edges of humiliation. I had heard worse, I told myself. Yet the way Isolde's lips tightened, then relaxed into a faint smile, unsettled me. She didn't defend me. She didn't even change the subject. She simply watched Verity with a look I hadn't seen before, admiration, almost hunger. As the months wore on, I noticed the changes. Isolde's voice took on the same careful cadence Verity used, clipped and deliberate. She began gesturing with small, precise movements, as if every flick of her hand were rehearsed. In phone calls, she was brisk, efficient, as though warmth was something she no longer had time to spare. I told myself it was stress. Weddings stretched people thin. But every time Verity was in the room, Isolde seemed to stand taller, her spine straighter, her laugh quieter, as though she were auditioning for a part. And in those moments, I felt myself fading, not just from the center of her life, but from the edges too. Still, I kept paying invoices, kept saying yes when asked to transfer money, kept telling myself love required patience. I ignored the unease, because to acknowledge it meant facing a truth I wasn't ready to hold. That truth pressed harder now as the music swelled in the reception hall and I stood on the sidelines, clutching a badge that told me exactly where I belonged. The weeks leading up to the wedding had been filled with small reminders of where I stood, though at the time I told myself they were harmless oversights. When the schedule for the rehearsal dinner arrived, my name was missing from the list of speakers. I asked Isolde if she wanted me to prepare a toast, something simple, a few words about family. She hesitated just long enough for me to understand the answer before she said, "We thought we'd keep it short. Too many voices get messy." Her tone was polished, rehearsed, almost identical to Verity's. At the ceremony itself, I sat in the third row, tucked neatly behind distant cousins and family friends. I reminded myself it didn't matter, that what counted was seeing Isolde radiant in her gown. Still, as I watched the bridal party from my distant seat, I couldn't shake the sense that I was witnessing rather than belonging. Even our conversations had shifted. They used to be filled with small confidences, her favorite books, her doubts about her career path, the silly inside jokes that only siblings could understand. But in the months before the wedding, our calls had narrowed into lists, deposits due, deadlines looming, which florist had confirmed, which hadn't. Her voice was clipped, her gratitude more obligation than affection. Each time I hung up, I told myself it was the stress of planning, that the warmth would return once the vows were spoken and the details faded into memory. I convinced myself she would look for me in the crowd, call me to her side, acknowledge me not just as the sister who helped keep the gears turning, but as family who mattered. That belief was the thread I held on to, even as it frayed with every exchange. It was the only reason I kept answering her calls, kept wiring money when there was a gap, kept telling myself love was patient, that it endured small exclusions. Now, standing in the corner of the reception hall with the badge pressed flat against my chest, I realized the pattern had only reached its inevitable conclusion. The thread had unraveled, and I was no longer holding anything at all. The reception hall glowed with strings of fairy lights looped across beams and wrapped around pillars. Guests flowed into the room in clusters, their badges glinting under the soft light. I drifted toward the seating chart mounted on a gilded easel, scanning the neat rows of names. Table after table. Family grouped with family. Friends with friends. The groom's relatives filling the first two lines. My eyes traveled down to the end, then back again. Slower this time. My name wasn't there. I stood still, waiting for the letters to materialize, for some oversight to write itself. But the truth stared back at me, steady and undeniable. I had no place at any table. A waiter brushed past with a tray of champagne flutes, the bubbles catching in the glow. He didn't offer one to me. Another passed with salmon on porcelain plates. Again, not a glance in my direction. It was as though the badge pinned to my dress had turned me invisible. I moved toward the far edge of the room, finding cover behind a column wrapped in white fabric and lights. From there, I had a clear view of the head table. Isolde sat radiant, her lace gown catching every spark of light. She leaned toward her new husband, her smile wide and unguarded, while cameras flashed around them. People raised glasses, laughter spilling into the air like a song. Across the room, Cassian caught my eye. He was already watching me, his glass lifted in a mock salute. His grin spread slowly, satisfied, as though my absence from the chart was a private joke made public. I dropped my gaze, unwilling to give him the victory of seeing my face crack. the badge pressed into my skin, cheap paper against fabric, a mark of my place or my lack of it. I stayed behind the column, listening to the rhythm of applause and laughter wash over me without touching me, a tide I was never meant to enter. And then, almost without deciding, I turned toward the corner where the gift table sat, the envelope in my purse suddenly heavy, calling me forward. The gift table stood in the corner near the entrance, draped in white linen and crowded with glossy bags tied with satin bows. Cards sat stacked in gilded boxes, some with embossed seals, others with careful calligraphy. I scanned the display until I saw mine plain white. No ribbon, my handwriting sharp and unmistakable. No one had touched it. I stood over it for a moment, my fingers hovering just above the envelope. My chest tightened as I thought of the nights I had carried double shifts, the mornings I dragged myself home with aching legs, whispering promises that it would all be worth it. I thought of the vacations I never took, the small comforts I denied myself so the number inside could grow. $100,000. A lifetime of sacrifice folded neatly into paper. My hand closed around it before I could second-guess myself. The paper was cool against my palm, a fragile thing to hold the weight of so many years. I slipped it back into my purse, the zipper's teeth closing over it like a gate. A hush rippled behind me, faint but unmistakable. I could feel eyes on my back, the shift in the air as people turned toward the table and registered what I had done. A murmur passed like wind through leaves, soft at first, then sharper as it spread. Still, no one spoke to me directly. I straightened, lifting the strap of my purse higher on my shoulder. My steps toward the door were steady, though my heart thudded hard against my ribs. The music carried on behind me, clinking glasses and bursts of laughter swelling as if to drown out the sound of my retreat. And then, above it all, a voice cut through the noise, sharp, urgent, familiar. My name, called once, then again, louder. The gravel crunched under my heels as I moved down the path toward the parking lot, the cool night air settling around me like a cloak. Behind me, the music grew faint, muffled by distance, but the sound of my name carried above it Isolde's voice, sharp with panic. I kept my pace steady, the envelope secure in my purse, my fingers gripping the strap as though it tethered me to my decision. Another call rang out, closer this time, and I heard the unmistakable scrape of fabric against stone. I glanced back just long enough to see her, gown lifted in both hands, train dragging, her face pale in the glow of the vineyard lights. For an instant, the sight of her pulled at me, the same way it always had. I remembered the little girl clutching my sleeve at school pickups, the teenager sobbing into my lap after her first heartbreak. She looked the same now, desperate, reaching, afraid. But I turned away before the image could root itself deeper. My steps quickened, the weight of years pressing forward rather than back. The parking lot came into view, a line of cars glinting under dim lamps. My keys rattled as I pulled them free, my hand trembling only slightly as I fit the metal into the lock. "Please," she shouted, her voice breaking on the word. I paused, just for a breath, the sound cutting through me like glass. Then I opened the door, slid inside, and pulled it shut. The world outside muffled instantly, her voice reduced to a faint echo. The engine turned over, steady and sure, the hum vibrating beneath me as I shifted into reverse. Through the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of her, a figure in white, standing alone at the edge of the lot, hands hanging uselessly at her sides. I looked forward again, pressed my foot to the gas, and followed the winding road out of the vineyard, the lights and music receding until there was nothing but darkness ahead and the silence of my own breath. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky had shifted to that washed-out blue that follows a storm, though no rain had fallen. I sat in the car for a long while, the envelope resting on the seat beside me like a silent witness. My phone buzzed again and again, Screen flashing with names I didn't have the strength to face. I powered it off, carried the silence inside with me, and let it settle in the rooms like a new kind of furniture. That night, I brewed tea I didn't drink and sat at the kitchen table staring at the pale square of light spilling from the lamp. The quiet was heavy, but it was mine. I went to bed without answering a single message. The next afternoon, my phone lit up with a call from Marin, a friend of mine who sometimes worked weddings as a planner's assistant. Her voice was cautious, almost apologetic. "I thought you should know," she said, and the words unraveled everything I had tried to hold together. She told me I had been listed at the head table, right beside Isolde, in the original seating chart. Weeks ago, it was marked clearly in green ink. Then, just 4 days before the wedding, Verity requested changes. My name was shifted down the list to what she called overflow. The final draft bore Isolde's checkmark, her quiet consent. I thanked Marin and hung up, my hands trembling. The betrayal landed colder than rage, heavier than grief. It wasn't just Verity's doing. Isolde had seen, had agreed, had let it happen. I sat in the stillness, the envelope unopened beside me, knowing the silence between us had grown into something that could no longer be crossed. On the 4th day, the phone rang again. I almost let it go to voicemail, but the name on the screen held me still. Isolde's voice came through heavy, frayed at the edges. "We can't book the honeymoon without your check. The deposit is due tomorrow." I listened, letting the silence breathe. She filled it quickly, her words tumbling over each other. "I didn't mean for things to happen this way. Verity said the seating was tight, and I thought it didn't matter where you sat. Please, I need you to help us." My throat tightened, but my voice came out calm, steadier than I felt. "If I ever give again, it won't be a gift. It will be on my terms, signed, clear, with conditions. Not one-sided anymore." There was only a soft intake of breath on the other end, then a faint sob. I let it sit there between us for a moment before I pressed the phone to end the call. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was mine. That evening, I slipped on gloves and carried a small box of bulbs into the garden. Near the fence, the soil was loose from the last rain. I knelt and pressed deep purple tulip bulbs into the earth, the same kind Isolde once called princess flowers when she was little. Only this time, I planted them for myself, for the part of me that had waited too long to be seen. The dirt clung to my fingers, cool and grounding. As I patted the soil back into place, the garden held me steady, the silence finally soft, no longer a wound, but a promise. The music from the string quartet drifted softly across the reception hall, a melody meant to frame joy, not conflict. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, champagne glass in hand, when I felt a sudden tug at my arm. My mother's voice, tight and deliberate, cut through the chatter. "Celine, we need a word." Now, before I could respond, my father was beside her, his grip firm on my elbow. They steered me toward a corner of the hall, away from the crowd, but still within sight of curious eyes. My chest tightened. I had sensed this moment coming all evening, though I told myself I was being paranoid. Daniel and Heather deserve a proper start, my mother said, her tone as smooth as porcelain but sharp underneath. "It's time you did the right thing." I looked from her face to my father's, waiting for clarity, but he wasted no time. "Give them your penthouse," Gerald demanded flatly. "Announce it tonight, as their wedding gift." For a moment, the words didn't register. The audacity of it felt surreal, like I had stepped into a play where my lines had been swapped without warning. "My home," I said quietly. "That's not yours to give. You don't need it." My father pressed, his voice low but firm. "You're single. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. All that space for one person. Selfish. Your brother has a family to build." Around us, conversations faltered. Guests noticed our cornered huddle. My refusal was calm, measured. No. I worked for that home. It's mine. The next moment happened in a blur. My father's hand rose and struck me across the face, the sound cracking through the reception louder than the music. Gasps rippled through the room. My cheek burned, my head snapping to the side. The silence that followed was heavier than the blow itself. 250 eyes locked on us, frozen between disbelief and judgment. I straightened my spine, forced my voice steady, and whispered so only he could hear, "You just lost me." I set my glass on a nearby table and walked through the parted crowd, each step carrying me further from the life I had once begged to belong to. I learned early what it meant to be background noise in my own home. In Portland, the Calloway household revolved around Daniel, 3 years younger than me and treated as though he carried the family's legacy on his small shoulders. My father spoke of him with pride that seemed inexhaustible, as if Daniel were the answer to every hope he had ever carried for the Calloway name. I was expected to understand. After all, I was the daughter. One day I would marry, change my last name, and fade into someone else's story. Daniel, by contrast, was the son who would keep the bloodline intact. That belief shaped every decision my parents made. When Daniel brought home a report card scattered with B's, it was framed on the refrigerator. When I came home with straight A's and first-place ribbons from debate tournaments, my mother smiled politely and asked if I'd remembered to set the table. Daniel joined the soccer team, and my parents bought him new cleats, uniforms, and paid for extra coaching. When I needed new track shoes, I was told to use babysitting money. The favoritism wasn't subtle. It was doctrine. My father's voice carried across every football field Daniel played on, cheering until he was hoarse. My debate championships, my track meets they were too often missed, excused by errands or family priorities. At first, I tried harder. I thought if I could be perfect, if I could excel beyond question, they would see me. Scholarships, honor roll, extracurriculars. I stacked them like bricks in a wall, hoping the height would force them to look up. They didn't. What they saw was a daughter who could take care of herself and a son who always needed more. Daniel became their center, and I became the shadow orbiting around him. Yet in that shadow, a determination began to grow quiet, steady, unshakable. If no one else would claim my worth, then I would. That fire carried me into the years where I would build a life of my own, a life they never thought I deserved. College was my escape hatch, though it came at a price. I earned scholarships through grades and competitions, but they never covered everything. By graduation, I carried $40,000 in student loans on my shoulders. My parents reminded me often that I was lucky to even be there since all their savings were tied up for Daniel's future. I nodded, swallowed the sting, and paid my own bills. When I stepped into the financial world, I knew there would be no shortcuts. I took every project no one else wanted, volunteered for holiday shifts, stayed long after the office emptied. My friends from school posted pictures from beach vacations and weekend getaways. I stayed at my desk, eyes blurry from spreadsheets, clinging to the belief that this grind would lead me somewhere no one could deny. 80-hour weeks became my normal. Birthdays were forgotten. Relationships ended before they could begin. My body ached from the pace, but my portfolio grew. By 28, I had moved up to senior financial advisor, one of the youngest in the firm. Clients trusted me, not because I was charming, but because I delivered results when others wouldn't. At 30, I signed papers for the purchase of my penthouse in downtown Seattle, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, walls of glass opening onto views of the skyline and Puget Sound. The price tag was $1.5 million, a number that once would have been unfathomable. As I stood in the empty living room that first night, city lights spilling across polished floors, I let myself believe I had finally secured something no one could diminish. Meanwhile, Daniel floated from one short-lived job to another, always cushioned by my parents. They excused his failures as finding his way, wrote checks when he couldn't cover rent, and boasted about his potential as if it were an achievement. He had safety nets at every turn, while I had cliffs. It was a contrast too sharp to ignore, though I tried, because sooner or later, I would learn just how much my success had become a target. Daniel met Heather at a friend's gathering, and from the first introduction I could tell she was gentle in a way my brother needed. She was a kindergarten teacher with endless patience, the sort of woman who smiled through interruptions and listened without rushing to speak. 8 months later, when they announced their engagement, my parents reacted as though royalty had blessed our family. They didn't have much in savings, but that didn't stop them from promising to cover the entire wedding. The irony wasn't lost on me when I had asked for help with tuition. There was never enough to spare. For Daniel, though, they were willing to stretch retirement funds thin, calling it an investment in the future of the family. I wanted to be supportive, despite the old sting. When I offered to host an engagement dinner at my penthouse, Heather seemed genuinely grateful. She admired the view, asked thoughtful questions about my work, and thanked me more than once. For a brief evening, I let myself believe maybe this milestone could bring us closer. Then came the subtle shift. Marion wandered through my home as though she were conducting an inspection, running her hand along countertops and pausing at artwork. "All very modern," she remarked, her tone laced with disapproval. Gerald, never subtle, asked outright what the mortgage was, whether I thought it wise to tie up so much money in one place. His words were framed as curiosity, but the edge was sharp enough to cut. The dinner carried on with laughter and toasts, but beneath it ran an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. My home wasn't admired, it was measured, weighed, and quietly criticized. I caught the way my parents exchanged glances when Heather complimented the terrace, and I felt a shift inside me. What I had built, what I had fought for, was no longer just my achievement. It had become something for them to covet. I brushed it off that night, telling myself I was imagining shadows where none existed. But those shadows only grew darker in the weeks that followed. The weeks leading up to the wedding blurred into errands and obligations. I picked up Daniel's tuxedo when he forgot it at the tailor, stuffed envelopes with last-minute invitations, and even coordinated the florist when the original delivery ran behind schedule. Heather was gracious every step, apologizing for the chaos and thanking me for stepping in. I told her not to worry. Truthfully, I wanted to ease her stress, even if it meant carrying more than my share. At the rehearsal dinner, I raised a glass to toast the couple. My words came easily, a hope that Heather's patience would soften Daniel's stubborn streak, and that together they'd build something strong. Guests clapped. Heather teared up, and for a brief moment I felt included, like maybe all the old wounds were finally scabbing over. But then the whispers began, small, drifting comments that floated just within earshot. An aunt leaned toward another relative and murmured, "That penthouse of hers would be perfect for them." A cousin smirked as she passed me on her way to the buffet, whispering, "Lucky Daniel." At first, I brushed it off as the idle speculation that fills family gatherings. But the chorus grew louder, more pointed. I overheard my uncle remark, "She can't possibly need all that space on her own." Another chimed in, "Generosity runs in families. She'll do the right thing." The turning point came when my cousin Sophia pulled me aside in the hallway, her expression serious. "Celine, you need to know something. Your parents have been telling people you're giving Daniel the penthouse as a wedding gift. They've been saying it for weeks." I stared at her, stunned. "That's absurd. I never said that." "I know," she whispered quickly, "but they've told so many people. It's practically gospel now. Be careful tomorrow." Her warning settled into me like a stone. I felt my face heat with both anger and disbelief. How could they twist my success into something I was expected to hand over, as if all the years of sacrifice meant nothing? Still, I smiled when I returned to the table, determined not to let it show. For Heather's sake, for the day she had dreamed about. I swallowed the unease and focused on celebrating her. I told myself the whispers were just talk, but beneath the laughter and clinking glasses, I knew something was gathering, waiting to break open. The reception hall glittered with lights strung across the ceiling, the kind of atmosphere meant to make everything feel enchanted. I sat at the long head table, smiling for photographs, clinking glasses when prompted, and trying to ignore the way my parents kept scanning the crowd, as though ensuring everyone was watching. Dinner plates were cleared, wine refilled, and then my father rose from his chair, tapping his knife against the side of his champagne flute. The room hushed almost immediately. Gerald Calloway had always carried a presence that demanded attention, and tonight was no exception. He began his speech with stories about Daniel's childhood, how he was always the boy with the biggest heart, the one who stayed close to family, who brought laughter into the house. Guests chuckled, and Daniel beamed beside Heather. I wanted to believe, for a moment, that this was just a father's joy spilling over. But then his tone shifted, subtle at first, then deliberate. Some people, he said, pausing to let the silence grow, are blessed with natural abilities, with success that seems to come easily. They collect wealth, possessions, accomplishments. His eyes swept the room but landed on me. Others, like Daniel, are blessed in different ways with generosity, with loyalty, with love for family above all else. A ripple of discomfort passed through the crowd. I felt it as surely as the heat rising in my cheeks. He lifted his glass higher. And family is what truly matters. As Daniel and Heather begin their life together, I know those among us who have been fortunate will step up to ensure they have the proper start in a proper home. The implication was unmistakable. Heads turned, glances flicked toward me, some curious, some pitying. My stomach twisted as the weight of 200 eyes pressed in. My father's toast was not a celebration. It was a public trap. I forced a smile, lifted my own glass, and clinked it against Heather's, though my hand trembled slightly. No words came from me. Silence was the only shield I had left in that moment. But inside, the walls were closing, and I could feel the confrontation circling closer, inevitable now, impossible to ignore. The music from the dance floor pulsed faintly as my parents guided me into a smaller side room, a space meant for the bride and groom to steal quiet moments. My mother shut the door behind us, leaving the sound of laughter and clinking glasses muffled beyond the walls. The air inside was heavy, charged with something I had felt building for weeks. "You've had your moment," my father began, his jaw set, voice sharp with authority. "Now it's time to think about your brother's future." I folded my arms, steadying myself. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Marion stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as if I were a disobedient child again. "Daniel and Heather can't start their life in that tiny apartment. You have more space than you'll ever need. 3 bedrooms, a terrace. You're alone. Celine, don't you think it's time to share what you have?" I let out a short laugh, more disbelief than humor. "Share. You're talking about my home, the one I worked for, the one I sacrificed years to afford. You wouldn't have anything if it weren't for us." She shot back. "We raised you, gave you life, put a roof over your head. Now it's your turn to give back." Something inside me cracked. "You didn't pay for college. You didn't show up at my meets. You saved everything for Daniel's future while I fought for mine. Don't stand here and pretend I owe you the roof over my head when I built it without you." My father's face hardened. He stepped closer, voice low but dangerous. "This isn't a request. Celine, sign the penthouse over to Daniel, or you're no daughter of mine." The words hung like a blade, and I knew the choice had finally arrived, as brutal and final as the slap that was waiting just ahead. The shouting had carried further than I realized. By the time my father's voice rose above mine, shadows filled the doorway. Relatives lingered, uncertain. curiosity pulling them closer. Then Gerald turned, his expression twisting into something almost performative. "Your sister is giving you her penthouse," he announced, projecting his voice toward the hall where guests were beginning to gather. A murmur rippled through the crowd, eyes darting between Daniel, Heather, and me. My brother looked confused, his new wife pale with shock. I stepped forward, steadying my voice. "That isn't true. I never said that." Gasps broke the silence, sharp intakes of breath like cracks in glass. My father's face darkened, and in that moment he seemed less apparent and more a man cornered, desperate to hold authority slipping away. "Stop embarrassing us," he hissed. "You'll do as you're told. I won't." I answered, each word deliberate. "The penthouse is mine. It isn't a wedding gift. It never was." The room tightened around us, whispers swelling like a tide. I felt the weight of every gaze, the sting of judgment, but I stood unmoving. For once, I wasn't shrinking beneath their expectations. And then, in one violent instant, the argument ended. His hand came down across my cheek with a crack that echoed louder than the music outside. My head snapped sideways, the sting blooming into heat that pulsed beneath my skin. The silence that followed was suffocating. Heather's hand flew to her mouth. Daniel didn't move, rooted in place, his silence louder than any defense he could have offered. My mother looked away, as though distance could erase what had just happened. I straightened, ignoring the burn on my face, and locked eyes with the man who had struck me. My voice dropped to a whisper, calm but final. "You just lost me." Without another word, I pushed through the stunned circle of guests, each step deliberate, leaving behind the music, the lights, and the family that had finally shown me exactly what I meant to them. By the time I reached my penthouse, the adrenaline had burned off, leaving only a hollow ache. I closed the door behind me and slid to the floor, pressing my palms against the cold tile as sobs ripped through me. My cheek throbbed, a deep red mark already darkening into what I knew would be a bruise. When I finally lifted my phone, the screen glowed with missed calls and messages. Some were from cousins and friends, voices of outrage and comfort. "What your father did was wrong. We're here if you need anything." Others carried blame like barbed wire. "You ruined your brother's wedding. Apologize before it's too late." Daniel's texts cut the deepest. He didn't ask if I was hurt, didn't question what our father had done. Instead, "You made a scene. Heather's crying. You ruined everything." My parents' voicemails painted me as the aggressor, twisting reality into a narrative where I had provoked, embarrassed, betrayed. The next morning, Heather arrived unannounced. She stood in the doorway, her face pale, eyes wide when she saw the bruise. "Celine, I didn't realize it was that bad. I let her in, though I kept distance between us." She hesitated before speaking. "They told us weeks ago that you'd promised the penthouse, that it was only a matter of when you'd announce it. I believed them. I thought you were being generous." Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry." I studied her, searching for any sign of complicity, but all I saw was shame. "Thank you for telling me," I said finally, but believing them nearly cost me everything. I can't keep pretending this family isn't what it is. Heather nodded, unable to meet my eyes. When she left, I felt the quiet settle differently, no longer grief alone, but the beginning of a line I would not let them cross again. The bruise on my cheek faded, but I made sure to document it. Photos, dates, notes, proof of what had been done. Margaret urged me into therapy, and for once I didn't argue. Week by week, I learned to name the years of neglect for what they were, and to understand that survival wasn't selfishness. My circle tightened, friends like Margaret and Allison stepping in with meals, laughter, and presents that felt more like family than anything I'd known at home. Then came the letter, cold, formal, typed on my father's business stationery, "Sign the penthouse over to Daniel or you will no longer be our daughter." No apology. No acknowledgement of violence. Only a transaction disguised as legacy. I filed it away without reply. Their silence afterward was louder than their words. Months passed. Work flourished. My name floated for partnership, and I used my first real bonus to redecorate the penthouse, not for appearances, but for me. I filled it with bold colors, soft chairs, and walls that finally reflected my taste, not theirs. It became a sanctuary, not a battleground. When I ran into Daniel at a cafe, he looked smaller somehow, his eyes tired. He muttered that things at home weren't the same, that Heather questioned their parents' hold on him. For a heartbeat, I felt the tug of wanting to reach back, but I remembered the bruise, the whispers, the silence. If you want a relationship, it has to be without them controlling it. I said, blood may bind, but I had learned at last only respect makes a family.